Yes. Okay. Another interesting fact about Venice is that they had a massive fleet uh, of galleys. Now, a galley is a boat that is powered by oars. Of course, the people rowing the oars were slaves or convicts, which were used in such a way. Now, there was a very decisive battle in 1572 between the Muslim forces of the Middle East and European powers. You know that Islam, to them, it was very important to expand their faith through conquest. For example, if you think which countries in Africa are Muslim countries, it is all the countries along the littoral, in other words, along the coast of Africa. North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and then along the eastern coast, Somalia, part of Kenya, Tanzania, etc. Why? All these coastal places? Because Islam conquered through ships, also through galleys, also using slaves and convicts as the people rowing the oars. Now, this was a decisive battle because Islam wanted to also conquer Europe. And at this Battle of Lepanto, it was the fleet of Venice that was decisive in defeating the Muslim fleet and thus allowed Europe to stay a Christian country. If you want to draw a few conclusions, if it hadn't been for that fact, if it hadn't been for this battle in the favor of Europe, thanks to Venice, Europe would have been a Muslim continent. And any white offspring from Europe, like most of us white people in South Africa, would have been Muslims. Just like many of our ethnic groups and cultural groups in South Africa are Muslim because they come from the East, the Far East, places like Malaysia, etc. Okay, I'll try to come closer to the point now. Venice was a wonderful city, not only for the sights, but also for the smells. As we said, Venice was a meeting point of East and West, and especially it was on the trading route, the spice route between the East and the West. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a so-called Oriental market. We knew it in Durban as the Indian market. To me, it was one of the most memorable experiences when I, as a Free Stater, visiting Durban, went to the Indian market. Those exotic smells of all the different kinds of curry, all the colors, all the other herbs and spices that you would find there, those smells were almost intoxicating because those were smells that I had never, ever experienced before. So there was also, Venice was also associated with lovely smells in opposition to the kind of noxious and awful smells that you normally found in other cities. Now, why did Venice not have these smells of sewerage that you found in other cities? Because Venice consisted mainly of canals. In other words, water streets. By the way, there were parts of Venice that were not underwater, where you had normal streets and alleys, but the important part of Venice was underwater. So in Venice, you didn't have the awful smells normally associated with cities, but you had these wonderful exotic smells, and of course the smell of the sea, which is also a very evocative and wonderful smell. The other thing was that Venice was also a hub of the trade in silk between China and Europe, and also the trade in other materials from India, which were imported via Venice to the rest of Europe. Now, what these merchants would do, they would display the bolts of material by hanging it out of their windows. So wherever you walked, or then traveled with your gondola or your boat, you would see these colorful bolts of silk or of other material coming from the east with beautiful patterns and bright colors, which also made Venice a very romantic city. A last thing about smells and sights, there was also a lot of things to delight the ear. Apparently, it was quite a custom in Venice to have a singing bird in a lovely cage. So everywhere you went, you would hear these lovely singing of birds, and of course, again, the lapping of the waves, all very soothing sounds. Okay, to carry on. If I asked you in a modern city or even in old cities, where is most noise generated and by what? Where do most noises come from? It is generated in the streets. Nowadays, of course, you've got the motor cars and the car sirens and so on. Sirens and sounds and noises that wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the streets. Now, even though you might not realize it, in earlier centuries, the noise was even worse. Remember, they didn't have tarred roads, they used cobbles. Now, imagine the noise that a coach or a wagon would make with its wheels on those cobbles. And remember, many of those wheels, although they were made from wood, were then rounded with a piece of metal to strengthen it. Now imagine, that noise of metal on cobbles. It was very noisy. Also the costermongers and the fishmongers and the other merchandise that was sold on the streets, they were transported with barrows, wheelbarrows, etc., etc. So there was a lot of noise. And of course, the smell of horse manure, because most of the carriages were drawn by horses. Right. When a visitor from Western Europe or from England came to Venice, the thing that struck them most was the absolute silence. No noises, no sound except the lapping of waves and perhaps the singing of the birds. No awful smells. To them, it was an amazing experience, and people from the 16th century and even earlier used to even walk great distances to be able to visit Venice and experience all these wonderful things about Venice. So, certainly, in earlier centuries, Venice was by far the most wonderful and romantic city in the world. I will later give you some quotes by contemporary travelers visiting Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, but for now we will just stay with this. Now the last thing I do before I end this lecture, you will get the next lecture later, there will be a few installments. Venice, as we said, had the biggest and largest fleet in the world. In other words, it also had the largest port or harbor in the world. Now, that also means that, almost in a literary sense, there was unfortunately also a sordid underbelly to Venice. What is normally associated, even today, with harbors, large harbors and ports? What bad activity, to put it in a very unnuanced way? I'll give you a clue. If a sailor had been on a ship for weeks or months and he finally gets back to harbor, what are the two things he wants? It's not right, but what were the two things that he wanted? Booze and a woman. So prostitution was rife in Venice, more than in any other city, because it was the largest city and the largest port in the world. So prostitution, nowadays, of course, one would use the euphemism, sex work, but when all is said and done, the work still entails the same thing. The euphemism that was used in the 16th century and 17th century for a prostitute was a courtesan. Okay, just remember that. That is the euphemistic word that was used in previous centuries. Now, what would a courtesan do if she fell pregnant? because that meant her work and her income was endangered. Well, she had a few options. She could either have an abortion, which they tried, but which of course was fraught with dangers and normally ended in either the death or the serious injuries of the woman. So the alternative was to carry the baby to the end of term and then have the baby, which is what most prostitutes or courtesans did. And then once the baby was born, many, literally not only hundreds, but thousands of these prostitutes then threw the baby into the nearest canal to drown. It is not simply an urban legend. We have documentary evidence for that. In fact, it was a practice not only in Venice. We have documents from the Vatican, the Roman Catholic seat in Rome, in which one of the popes, I think in the 13th century, expresses his dismay at the sight of which he saw in the Tiber River. The Tiber is the river running through Rome. He was dismayed to see how many baby corpses were washed up on the shores of the Tiber River. Literally hundreds of little corpses. So that was a general practice. Yes, we'll continue I'll tell some other detail later on. If a mother didn't have the heart to do this, to simply dump the baby into the nearest canal, something that still happens today, we read about it often, a baby being found on a trash heap or in a dustbin, just abandoned and thrown away. If she didn't want to do that and also wasn't able to keep the baby or didn't want to keep the baby, there was one other option. Now, even though we might not have even ever read about it or thought about it, we actually all have an unconscious idea or picture in our mind about the events. And I'll try to picture it on your behalf. Imagine that it's the dark of night. Imagine that you see a little furtive figure, kind of camouflaged, with veils, face covered, walking the streets, but keeping to all the dark corners, with a little bundle or little box in her hand. And then eventually she comes to the steps of a church or a monastery or a convent, and she leaves the box there and she disappears. And then at some point, this box or this bundle starts crying. And the next moment, the door opens and a startled priest or nun sees this bundle, realizes it's a baby that's been deposited there, and takes the baby in. Now, that was a general practice in Venice like in other places. I will continue in a few moments.